Nietzsche has said, "What alone can our teaching be? That no one gives a human being his qualities. Not God, not society, not his parents or ancestors, not he himself. No one is accountable for existing at all, or for being constituted as he is, or for living in the circumstances and surroundings in which he lives. The fatality of his nature cannot be disentangled from the fatality of all that which has been and will be. He is not the result of a special design, a will, a purpose. He is not the subject of an attempt to attain an ideal of man, or an ideal of happiness, or an ideal of morality. It is absurd to want to hand over his nature to some purpose or other. We invented the concept of purpose. In reality, purpose is lacking. One is necessary. One is a piece of fate. One belongs to the whole. One is in the whole. There exists nothing which could judge, measure, compare, condemn our being, for that would be to judge, measure, condemn the whole. But nothing exists apart from the whole. That one is any longer made accountable, that the kind of being manifested cannot be traced back to a causa prima, that the world is a unity neither as sensorium nor as spirit. This alone is the great liberation. Thus alone is the innocence of becoming restored. The concept God has hitherto been the greatest objection to existence. We deny God. In denying God, we deny accountability. Only by doing that do we redeem the world. We deny God. In denying God, we deny accountability, and only by doing that do we redeem the world. What does it mean that we deny God and we deny accountability? It means that we deny a kind of accountability that is imposed upon us through our imaginations, a kind of accountability that causes us to be accountable to a phantom of the mind, to a subconscious creation and projection of the mind. Now, is it a good thing to be completely unaccountable? Certainly not. There is a level, a social level, a human level, in which accountability takes on a form of intelligence. But those of us, that consciousness within the development of the human species, that no longer wrestles with God, this consciousness that has been emancipated from God, this consciousness is engaged in the act of understanding accountability for the first time, as it has actual meaning within the context of human existence. Not accountability to an abstract being, a celestial tyrant that is imposed upon mankind, a tyrant that destroys the reality of morality in the social, a tyrant that shatters the prospect of human relation, because that human relation is then mediated through the lie of a cosmic being that is constructed for the purpose of special pleading, so that one culture with one morality could claim that that morality was higher than all other moralities. The argument was not made for its intelligence. The argument was not made for its civility. The argument was made that there was a celestial being, a great deity, that backed up this morality, that anchored and secured this morality, that would go to war, punish, maim, torture, kill for this morality. That is the history of the formation of the concept of God. It is a formation that was seeking out a cultural special pleading. A special pleading so that it could stand above those with whom the culture differed. So that it could claim that its own values, its own biases, had greater authority, greater value. And again, in this conversation, there was no talk of intelligence. There was no talk of civility. There was no talk of achieving greater humanitarian ends. The talk was that of bias, and the talk was that of special pleading. But human consciousness has moved on and is moving on past the point of primitiveness. There are those of us who are now aware that the construct of God was always that, simply and merely a construct. Human consciousness is collectively moving beyond this point, moving beyond this symbol, moving beyond this conceptual edifice, this crutch that it needed in order to postulate itself in the world as having significance, as having meaning, as having superior authority. Human consciousness is moving beyond this point. Those who wrestle with God are still left in primitive cultures. They are still bogged down by subconscious precepts of psychology. They are bogged down by psychological tactics and techniques that were utilized in culture to subvert cultures in the direction of authoritarian cultures, of a culture that wanted to be superior. The tactic of God still works on those who wrestle with God. But for those of us who no longer wrestle with God, we know that this is a mere tactic, a mere technique, and that God is a mere phantom of the mind. And the concept and principle of God, it has shown itself not once, not twice, but thousands of times throughout the process of human history, always appearing in divergent forms, emerging from the essence of the culture. So those of us who understand, as we look back upon the collective expanse of these cultures, we realize that this idea, this subjective, arbitrary, desperate idea, was simply constructed by culture after culture after culture. And so those of us who no longer wrestle with God have seen through the concept. We have seen through the tactic. We have seen through the technique. We are no longer moved by it. We are no longer manipulated by it. We are no longer deceived by it. But those who still wrestle with God, and those who want to wrestle with God, perhaps to bring excitement to life, because they can't cope with the reduction of reality down to its minute, mechanistic, material parts. They can't deal with and face the reality of finitude, of mortality. And so the concept of God is pulled out of the closet in an attempt to resurrect it, hoping that it will prop up the desperate psychology. And that is why we don't see the formation of God in culture in its fundamentalist, orthodox formation. That's why we see the God in culture as being a variation, as being transcribed into a new form of deity. We see a variation that occurs in the concept of deity, because the concept of deity is being constructed to prop up and meet the needs of a struggling psychology. Those who want to claim that they wrestle with God and that this is a virtue are wasting their lives, are wasting their powers, are wasting the powers of the species and pulling the species in the wrong direction. To say that an individual wrestles with God and that it's a virtue is to misunderstand what it means to wrestle with God. It means that you have a defect. It means that you have a crutch. It means that something is getting in the way from you seeing reality and interacting directly with reality. To wrestle with God means that you're wrestling with unicorns and green giants. It's every bit as absurd, every bit as nonsense, every bit as imaginary. And yet, there are many who postulate this as being a virtue, as being a sign of high intellectualism, an exemplar of a high thinker, of an intelligent thinker, when the very opposite is just the case. Those of us who no longer wrestle with the concept of God are part of the development of consciousness within the species that is progressing past its primitive forms, that is progressing past primitive cultures and emerging into a new culture. This new culture is the thing that's important. This new mindset, this new consciousness is the thing that's important, because it's the consciousness that wants to move into the future. It wants to face reality on its own terms. It's not merely trying to construct a deity so that it can handle the unpleasantness of material facts that it doesn't want to face or confront, and use that deity as a mediator, as an ideal to lean upon. That's the old consciousness. The new consciousness understands that we are floating in a cosmos, in a vast void of blackness and darkness of space. And that, as Nietzsche said, there has been no great purpose assigned to us. We must be the ones who forge this purpose. We must use our imagination not to construct a God with whom we wrestle, but to construct a better purpose and meaning for ourselves. To construct a better world. To construct better hope. To construct more intelligent values. To construct more intelligent ideals. Wrestling with God in one's imagination is not a sign that one is dealing with reality on its own terms. It's not a sign that one is engaged in a process of high intelligence. It's a sign that one is restricted and bogged down by a primitive past. It's a sign that one is unable to cope with the reality into which they are born. It's a sign that one is deceived and that one is somehow taking pleasure in that deception. Those of us who no longer wrestle with God, we don't have the luxuries of falling back upon this kind of crutch, upon this kind of projection, our imagination, to save us from the vast darkness. We know we must come together and save ourselves. We know we must come together and build a better world for ourselves and our children. Those who wrestle with God are engaged in juvenile work. They have not grown up within the context of the species. But those of us who no longer wrestle with God, we are engaged in the process of figuring out how to live life on its own terms, of how to construct intelligence, not subconsciously as it's been done in the formations of religion, but consciously and intelligently. Our mind and motivation, our courage is set toward facing the void of the universe, the desperate conditions of the universe, and we want to be intelligent in the context of this universe. Because so far as we know, that's the only thing that really does save us. The only thing the concept of God saves us from is the psychological struggle of having to deal with reality. It saves us from having to understand reality on its own terms. Those who wrestle with God are not engaged in a process of emancipation. They are engaged in a process of slavery, a slavery for themselves and a slavery to those who hear them. They are telling you that you have an imaginary being in your head that you have constructed, that others have constructed, a shared delusion, and that you should partake in this delusion, and that you should navigate your life and set your life in contrast against the notion of this delusion. They're telling us that we should engage in delusion. And all of this thought, all of the energy that is used and expended on this imaginary form, this thought could be expended in the domain of making a better humanity, of constructing a better and higher purpose. But it's not. The energy of the species is spent and wasted on the formation of an imaginary deified concept. And it's not that this concept is entirely lacking in value within the context of our evolutionary history. But we who no longer wrestle with God have grown beyond it. We are engaged in the process of emancipation, psychological emancipation. We're engaged in the process of coming to terms with reality as reality presents itself to us, whether we like it or not. We're willing to face it on its own terms because that's the only way that we can interact with it in such a way that we can expand or make progress within the context of reality. Those who are still wrestling with God and boasting of it are boasting of the fact that they are grappling and wrestling with their own imaginations and with collective imagination. This is not a virtue. This is not a freedom. This is not a courage. This is a regression. This is an evasion. This is an attempt to step away what feels unpleasant and manufacture and construct the make-believe in order to make ourselves feel better about reality. No different from unicorns and jolly green giants. But human consciousness is moving on. And it's moving on rapidly. And it doesn't matter if those who wrestle with God don't understand that human consciousness is moving into a state where there are now those of us who no longer wrestle with God. We have been emancipated from God. It doesn't matter if those who wrestle with God don't understand this, because the fact is that human consciousness is still moving forward in this way and has every prospect and possibility of continuing to move forward in this way. It must. It has no choice. If we want our knowledge to expand into reality, then this is a path that human consciousness must take. It cannot be tied down to the past in every way. At some point, even the individual who wrestles with God must come to understand that it is necessary to emancipate the species from this imaginary form, from this imaginary struggle. It is necessary to transcend beyond this state of consciousness. Those who don't understand this will continue to spend their lives grappling a good portion of it with their own imagination and with collective imagination. But understand that there is a world out there beyond this imaginary deity, beyond this notion of God. And it's not a world that condemns one to nothingness and despair. Because all of the things that are constructed on the basis of the concept of God, including God himself, is a construct. It is all constructed. So those of us who no longer wrestle with God understand this, that if primitive cultures, with their limited knowledge, were able to construct concepts such as God that gave them feelings of emancipation and power, and those concepts brought them happiness and unity, those of us who no longer wrestle with God realize and understand that we can do better than this. That the same mechanism of construction that brought about deities and religion is the same imaginative mechanism, the same conceptual mechanism that we can utilize to create more concrete concepts. To use these concepts to make a better world. To use these concepts to expand both human intelligence and human freedom.